Imagine standing at the edge of something vast, so vast that it doesn't care who you are. The Appalachian Trail stretches for more than 2,000 miles, through 14 states, over ridgelines where the wind never rests, and forests so dense the sun forgets how to reach the ground. It is a place of cliffs, storms, bears, snakes, and long stretches where help is just a rumor. Today, the people who attempt it are usually young, strong, prepared. They carry ultralight packs, GPS maps, titanium stoves. They train for years, and still, many of them quit. The trail humbles them. But in the spring of 1955, something unusual happened at the southern end of that trail, on a quiet mountain called Mount Oglethorpe. A small figure stepped onto the path. She was not an athlete. She was not an explorer. She was a grandmother. Her name was Emma Gatewood. She was 67 years old. She had no tent, no sleeping bag, no map. She wore thin canvas sneakers. Over her shoulder hung a simple denim sack she had sewn herself. Inside were a few scraps of food and a plastic shower curtain. When people asked her where she thought she was going like that, she didn't argue. She didn't explain. She just smiled and said, "I think I'll go for a walk." Perhaps you know this feeling. Not the urge to conquer something, but the need to keep moving before something inside you hardens forever. Because Emma was not walking toward glory. She wasn't chasing a record. She was walking away from something she never named. And the wild, for reasons she would only understand much later, felt safer than standing still. It began on a Tuesday. Emma Gatewood arrived at Mount Oglethorpe in Georgia, the southern terminus of the trail at that time. She didn't arrive in a support vehicle. She took a bus, then a taxi, and finally walked the last stretch just to get to the starting line. She stood barely 5 feet 2 inches tall. Her hair was silver, tied back in a sensible bun. She wore a simple gingham dress, not hiking pants. To the park rangers on duty, she looked like someone who had gotten lost on the way to a church picnic. A ranger looked at her gear, or rather, the lack of it. In 2026, we are obsessed with ultralight hiking. We spend thousands of dollars on titanium cookware and carbon fiber trekking poles. We weigh our toothbrushes. Emma Gatewood brought a drawstring sack. Let's look inside that sack, because what she carried tells you everything you need to know about who she was. She had no sleeping bag. Instead, she carried a wool army blanket. She had no tent. She carried a plastic shower curtain she bought at a discount store to shield herself from the torrential mountain rains. She had no stove. She ate cold food, Vienna sausages, peanuts, raisins, and bouillon cubes she would dissolve in water. And for safety, a small flashlight with weak batteries, a Swiss Army knife, and a small bottle of iodine for water purification. That was it. 17 pounds. That was her entire world. But the most shocking part wasn't the sack. It was her feet. Look at your shoes right now. Imagine walking from Georgia to Maine in them. Now, imagine doing it in a pair of Keds. Thin canvas, flat rubber soles, zero ankle support, zero shock absorption. The rangers warned her. They told her the trail was overgrown, that the markers were missing in huge sections, that men half her age had quit in tears. They looked at those sneakers and saw a death sentence. Emma listened politely. She didn't argue. She didn't try to explain that she had grown up on a farm, that she had worked her fingers to the bone every day of her life. That physical pain was an old friend to her. She simply adjusted the sack on her shoulder, a sack that would soon rub her skin raw. She tightened the laces on her Keds, and without a ceremony, without a camera crew, without anyone cheering her name, she turned her back on civilization. She took the first step into the green tunnel. She thought she was prepared. She thought she knew what hard work was. But the Appalachian Trail doesn't care about your past. It doesn't care how tough you are. And on that very first night, the reality of what she had done came crashing down. She was alone, truly alone. And the darkness of the woods was about to reveal its teeth. The first week on the trail was a disaster. The Appalachian Trail in 1955 wasn't the well-groomed path hikers enjoy today. It was a chaotic mess of fallen trees, overgrown briars that tore at skin like barbed wire, and washed-out bridges. Emma got lost, constantly. Without a map, she relied on white paint blazes on the trees. But many were faded, covered by moss, or simply gone. She would walk for hours, fighting through the undergrowth, only to realize she had walked in a giant circle. Her food ran out faster than she expected. She didn't have freeze-dried meals. When the jerky was gone, she reverted to survival mode, skills she had learned on the farm. She ate the forest. She foraged for wild onions, sorrel greens, and berries, hoping they weren't poisonous. At night, the temperature dropped. That shower curtain, it kept the rain off, but it offered zero warmth against the mountain chill. She developed a routine born of desperation. She would heat smooth stones in her campfire until they were scorching hot, then wrap them in her thin blanket and curl around them like a child holding a doll, just to stop the shivering. One night, she woke up to the sound of heavy breathing right outside her makeshift shelter. A bear? A bobcat? Most people would have been paralyzed with fear. Their hearts would hammer against their ribs. They would pack up and flee home the next morning, convinced that the wild was trying to kill them. But Emma didn't leave. She didn't even scream. She simply lay there, gripping her walking stick, her eyes open in the dark. Why? Because to Emma Gatewood, the sound of a beast outside her tent was nothing. She had spent 30 years listening to a much more terrifying sound. To understand why Emma Gatewood could walk through hell, you have to meet the devil she lived with. Perry Gatewood, her husband of 30 years. Emma wasn't walking toward a destination. She was walking away from a memory. Let's go back to that kitchen in Ohio. For 3 decades, her home wasn't a sanctuary. It was a prison. Every evening, Emma learned to read the air. She knew that the way the front door opened could determine if she would sleep that night or if she would bleed. She learned to make herself invisible. She learned to hold her breath so quietly that she almost ceased to exist. Perry was a violent man, but it wasn't just the violence. It was the unpredictability. He beat her because the dinner was cold. He beat her because the children were too loud. He beat her because he simply felt like it. He broke her teeth. He cracked her ribs. He turned her safe haven into a war zone. Compare that to the forest. One night on the trail, a massive storm hit. The wind was howling, tearing at the trees. The rain was freezing. Emma was huddled under her plastic sheet, wet and cold. But as she lay there, shivering, she realized something that changed everything. The thunder was loud. Yes, but the thunder didn't hate her. The wind was cold. Yes, but the wind wasn't trying to break her spirit. The bear outside was dangerous, yes, but the bear was honest. It only wanted food. It didn't want to humiliate her. in her house. The storm had a name, Perry. And that storm was malicious. So, when people asked Emma if she was afraid of the wild animals, if she was afraid of the dark, she didn't just say no. She meant it from the bottom of her soul. Compared to Perry, the Appalachian Trail was peaceful. She had endured broken bones and a broken heart. What was a blister compared to that? What was a little hunger compared to the starvation of love she had felt for 30 years? One afternoon, sitting under her shower curtain in a downpour, nursing her bleeding feet, Emma realized something profound. Her legs hurt. Her back ached. She was hungry, but for the first time in 30 years, the pain she felt was her pain. No one was inflicting it on her. She had chosen this struggle. She owned this pain. She looked at the bruises on her arms. These bruises were from scrambling over rocks to see a sunrise, not from a fist raised in anger. And in that moment, amidst the mud and the exhaustion, Grandma Gatewood found something she hadn't felt since she was a little girl. She felt safe. She was free. But the trail wasn't done with her yet. She had survived the start, and she had conquered her ghosts. But nature has a way of breaking you just when you think you've figured it out. Hurricane Connie was forming in the Atlantic, and it was heading straight for the mountains. But the Appalachian Trail is not just a monster, it is also a church. As the weeks turned into months, something changed in Emma. The initial shock of the cold and hunger began to fade. Her body stopped fighting the trail and started moving with it. Let's step inside her shoes for a moment. Let's look at a typical Tuesday in the life of Emma Gatewood. It starts before dawn. The air is misty and cold. She crawls out from under her plastic shower curtain, shaking the dew off her wool blanket. Her joints are stiff. At 67, sleeping on the hard ground isn't kind, but she doesn't complain. She gathers dry twigs. She lights a small fire. She boils water in a tin cup for a bouillon cube. That's breakfast. Warm, salty water and a handful of peanuts. Then she slings that denim sack over her shoulder. 17 pounds, and the walking begins. Left foot, right foot, she falls into a trance. She stops rushing. In this repetition, she found a silence she had never known. For the first time in her life, she had time to look, really look, at the world. She didn't just walk past the forest. She lived in it. She would stop to pick wild strawberries by the path, tiny red bursts of sugar that tasted better than any candy she'd ever bought. She dug up sassafras roots to chew on. She sat for an hour just watching a colony of ants march over a log, or listening to the wind move through the hemlock trees. She began to talk to the forest. She sang to it. She later wrote in her diary about these moments. She didn't write about the pain. She wrote about the beautiful moonlight on the rocks. She wrote about the taste of cold spring water. Nature was acting as a poultice, drawing the poison out of her spirit. The mountains didn't judge her. They didn't care that she was a battered wife. They didn't care that she was poor. To the mountain, she was just another creature passing through. But the healing didn't just come from the trees. It came from the very thing Emma had lost faith in: people. Before the trail, Emma's world was defined by the cruelty of one man. She had learned to be guarded. She expected the worst from everyone, but on the trail, she became a legend before she even knew it. Word traveled fast from town to town. There's a grandma walking the trail. And this is where the magic happened. Not on the peaks, but on the porches. Imagine coming out of the deep woods, dirty, smelling of wood smoke and sweat, and stumbling upon a farmhouse. A screen door opens. A stranger doesn't reach for a shotgun. They reach for an extra plate. People who had nothing to gain took in this ragged old woman. They sat her down at their kitchen tables. They fed her fried chicken, thick slices of ham, and corn on the cob dripping with butter. One night, a family found her sleeping on a pile of leaves near their property. Instead of chasing her away, they brought her inside. They gave her a warm bath. They washed her clothes. They put her in a guest bedroom with clean, white sheets that smelled of lavender and soap. She lay there in the dark, listening to the house settle, no shouting, no slamming doors, no fear of heavy footsteps coming down the hall, just the sound of a family living in peace. This was the second miracle of the trail. Emma realized that the world was not Perry. The world was full of kindness, if you were brave enough to walk out and find it. Every hot meal was a reminder. You are worthy of care. Every clean sheet was a reminder. You are safe. She wasn't just walking away from her demons anymore. She was walking toward humanity, recharged by the beauty of the land and the kindness of strangers. Emma picked up her pace. She was stronger now. Her legs were like iron. But nature has a way of humbling you just when you get confident. She had made it through the southern heat. But now, she was heading north. And up there, two massive hurricanes were about to collide with the mountains. The hardest part of the journey wasn't behind her. It was waiting ahead. August 1955. The tail end of Hurricane Connie smashed into the Appalachian Mountains, dumping inches of rain in hours. Then came Hurricane Diane right behind it. Most hikers evacuated. The trails turned into rivers. The shelters were flooded. Emma Gatewood was still out there. She was soaked to the bone. Her gear, that flimsy shower curtain, was useless against a storm of this magnitude. She was cold, so cold that her fingers couldn't even untie the knots on her sack. But then, disaster struck. Not from the sky, but from her own clumsiness. Her glasses. She had tripped on a slick rock and smashed them. For a 67-year-old woman, this wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a catastrophe. Without them, the trail became a blur of green and brown. Every route became a tripping hazard. Every shadow became a potential predator. She couldn't see the copperheads hiding in the leaves. She couldn't see the rattlesnakes sunning themselves on the rocks until she was inches away. She was nearly blind, freezing, and alone in a hurricane. If there was ever a moment to quit, this was it. All she had to do was walk down to the nearest road and stick out her thumb. No one would blame her. She had already walked farther than anyone expected. But Emma didn't walk down. She did something that defined her generation. She simply picked up the pieces of her broken glasses and kept walking. She relied on instinct. She felt the trail with her feet. When she couldn't see the blazes on the trees, she looked for the worn-down earth where others had stepped. Imagine navigating a minefield blindfolded. That became Emma's reality. Without her glasses, the world lost its edges. A rock wasn't a rock anymore. It was a gray smudge that could twist an ankle. A root wasn't a root. It was a shadow that could trip her into a ravine. She had to change the way she moved completely. She stopped hiking and started feeling. She used her walking stick like a blind person's cane. tapping the ground before every single step. Tap. Step. Tap. Step. Her pace slowed to a crawl. The mental exhaustion was worse than the physical pain. Every step was a calculation. Every step was a gamble. Her mind began to play tricks on her. Was that a log? Or was it a copperhead snake coiled in the path? Was that the sound of wind? Or was it the rushing water of a flash flood ahead? Panic is a hiker's worst enemy. When you can't see, fear fills in the blanks. There were moments of absolute terror where she stood frozen, gripping her stick, convinced she was surrounded. She could have sat down and cried. She could have waited for a rescuer who might never come. But Emma possessed a weapon that modern technology cannot replicate, a stubborn refusal to be a victim. She began to memorize the texture of the trail through the soles of her thin sneakers. She learned to trust the balance of her own body. She told herself, "I have walked through 30 years of darkness in my own home. I can walk through a few hundred miles of blurry woods." This wasn't just about eyesight. It was about insight. She was learning that she didn't need to see the whole path to move forward. She only needed to see the next 3 feet. When she encountered a swollen river that had washed away the bridge, she didn't turn back. She waded in. The water rushed up to her waist, threatening to sweep her tiny frame away. She held her sack over her head and fought the current, step by step. Why? Why didn't she stop? Because she had made a promise to herself. Years later, when asked about these moments, she didn't speak of them with horror. She spoke with a terrifying calmness. "I thought I might die," she said. "But if I died, at least I'd be free." This wasn't just hiking anymore. This was a war against her own limitations. She was proving to Perry, to her children, and to the world that she was unbreakable. But the body has limits. By the time she reached New England, she was a skeleton. She had lost over 30 pounds. Her dress was in tatters. Her shoes were held together with tape. She looked like a ghost haunting the woods. And that's exactly when the world finally noticed her. The hermit was about to become a celebrity. This is the news. A 67-year-old grandmother is attempting to walk the entire Appalachian Trail. Somewhere in Connecticut. The secret got out. Local newspapers picked up the story, then the Associated Press. By the time Emma crossed into New England, she wasn't just a hiker anymore. She was a phenomenon. Suddenly, the solitude of the woods was broken. Reporters were waiting for her at trailheads. They hiked in just to get a picture of the walking grandma. They expected a publicity stunt. They expected someone seeking attention. What they found was a woman wearing rags. Her Keds were destroyed. She was on her 6th or 7th pair by now. Her glasses were broken. Her skin was leathered by the sun. The reporters asked her the same question over and over. Why? Why are you doing this? They wanted a philosophical answer. They wanted a political statement. Emma looked at them, adjusted her sack, and gave the most badass answer in hiking history. Because I wanted to. She didn't tell them about Perry. She didn't tell them about the beatings. She didn't sell her trauma to the press. She kept her dignity. She became a Rorschach test for America. Young women saw a rebel. Older people saw a hero. The hiking community saw a miracle. But fame didn't make the hiking easier. In fact, it was a distraction. People offered her rides. They offered to carry her pack. She refused them all. "If I don't walk it myself," she said. "It doesn't count." She was stubborn. She was proud. And she was running out of time. Winter was coming early to Maine. September 25th, 1955. 146 days, 2,050 miles. Emma stood at the base of Mount Katahdin. This is the end of the line, and it is a beast. The climb to the summit isn't a hike. It's a scramble over boulders the size of cars. For a young person, it's exhausting. For a 67-year-old woman who has been walking for 5 months straight, it should have been impossible. Katahdin is not just a mountain, it is a fortress of granite. The trail doesn't wind gently to the top, it goes straight up. In some places, the path is nothing more than iron rungs drilled into vertical rock faces. For a young man in his prime, this climb is a lung-burning ordeal. For Emma, it was an act of pure defiance against biology. Look at her body at this moment. The doctors would later say she was walking on sheer willpower. Her reserves of fat were gone. Her muscles had cannibalized themselves for energy. Her joints were grinding bone on bone with every lift of her leg. The wind on Katahdin is notorious. It screams across the exposed ridges, trying to peel hikers off the rock. Emma was so light now, so frail, that the gusts threatened to blow her over the edge like a dried leaf. She had to crouch low, gripping the cold, rough stones with fingers that were gnarled and stiff. There were false summits, moments where she thought she had reached the top, only to crest a ridge and see another massive wall of rock rising ahead. This is the moment that breaks the spirit. This is the moment where the body screams, "Enough." But Emma didn't listen to her body. She listened to something deeper. With every painful step, she was shedding the weight of her past. One step for the day she was beaten. One step for the day she was humiliated. One step for the days she felt worthless. She wasn't climbing a mountain anymore. She was climbing out of a pit. She was clawing her way back to dignity. The higher she went, the smaller her demons became. The pain in her legs was screaming, but her heart was singing. Her body was failing. She had lost so much weight that her clothes hung off her like scarecrow rags. Her feet were a mess of calluses and blisters. But she started climbing. She pulled herself up, rock by rock, hand over hand. She thought about the doubters, the rangers who said she'd die, the neighbors who whispered about her crazy marriage. She thought about the years she spent cowering in her kitchen, afraid of the sound of her husband's footsteps. Now, the only footsteps were her own. The wind on the summit was tearing at her. The clouds were so thick she could barely see the sign ahead. And then, she was there. Baxter Peak, the end of the world. She walked up to the wooden sign. She didn't collapse. She didn't cry hysterically. She didn't raise her fists in victory like a boxer. She simply stood there. She opened her mouth, and she sang. "Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain." She sang to the wind. She sang to the mountains that had tried to kill her and then healed her. She had done it. She had walked out of the prison of her past. She had walked until she wasn't Perry's wife anymore. She was just Emma. She signed the register at the top. Name, Mrs. Emma Gatewood. Age, 67. Equipment, sack. She was the first woman to hike the trail alone. She was the first person to do it in one season without help. She looked down from the peak at the world below, a world that looked so small now. "I said I'll do it," she whispered, "and I've done it." You might expect a story like this to end at the summit, with applause, with victory. But that isn't how Emma Gatewood's story ends. After walking more than 2,000 miles, she didn't retire into legend. She went home. She rested. And then she walked again and again, into her 70s, into new trails, into new distances. Not because she was proving something, but because she had learned something, that freedom does not arrive all at once. It arrives one step at a time. Emma never spoke much about what she left behind. She didn't turn her pain into a speech. She didn't ask the world to understand her. She simply kept walking until her body could no longer carry her. And maybe that is the quiet lesson she leaves us. That you don't have to explain why you need to leave. You don't have to justify why you're tired of enduring. You don't even have to know exactly where you're going. You're allowed to take a step before you feel ready. You're allowed to choose a different path without announcing it. You're allowed to walk, slowly, imperfectly, toward a life that feels safer inside your own skin. If this story stirred something in you, you don't have to act on it tonight. Just notice it. Hold it gently. And remember this. You are not weak for wanting peace. You are not late for wanting more life. Your story matters. Your light matters. And remember, it is never too late to shine.